Canada's largest public service union is in turmoil over the handling of allegations of anti-black racism. Two people have resigned this month from leadership positions at the Public Service Alliance of Canada, including the second in command, Vice President Magali Picard, who stepped down in the wake of a firestorm over a previous resignation. Amanda Pfeffer is here to explain. Amanda, how did this begin?
Amarkai Larrier stepped down in early September from a management role as acting director at the Representation and Legal Services branch. Now, he was the only black man in that management role at the PSAC. Now, CBC obtained an email he sent to colleagues explaining he no longer felt supported after that meeting with President Chris Aylward and Vice President Magali Picard. Now, he said in that meeting, Picard made comments that made him feel that when I am a director, I need to leave my blackness at the door, that my experiences are no longer welcome. Now, he said the conversation was about an article that he wrote in an internal newsletter. He wrote about microaggressions working at the PSAC, and he said he felt reprimanded. Picard tried to clarify matters when she appeared on a Facebook town hall. She disputed the issue was over this article.
Thank you, Mary. So please, when you say that some people were microaggression, I don't know what you said exactly, because they talk in the newspaper, I can assure you 200% that is not true. Never, ever, okay? That has nothing to do with who we are.
Now, she said that as an Indigenous woman, she would never muzzle a fellow employee, but her appearance seemed to aggravate the situation, and there were calls for her resignation. And last Wednesday, she did just that. Now, the PSAC posted this release about her departure. It says that she left to attend to her family. Now, Picard spoke to CBC today.
One thing is sure, I'm really sad that this person is hurt. I'm really sad that now this is what we're going to talk, now that I'm going to my retirement. This is not the legacy that I wanted to leave to PSAC.
Now, the president, Chris Aylward, put out a statement to CBC. He said, we are struggling to do better every day, but in the process, we continue to make mistakes. Now, he says losing the union's only black director is a terrible loss, acknowledging that the hurt that was felt by black, Indigenous, and racialized employees. He said, as PSAC's national president, I accept full responsibility for this and have committed to put the union on a path that will start a process of healing. Nicholas Thompson hosted that union town hall we saw earlier. Now, he says this matters to the 200,000 federal workers that depend on this union to address these very same issues in the workplace. Now, Thompson notes that this is not a victory. The movement has just lost two racialized managers in a labor movement that has very few. But he hopes this public turmoil leads to some positive change.
This is Union Matters with Nicholas Thompson. Please welcome social justice advocate Nicholas Thompson.
Good evening. Welcome to Union Matters. My name is Nicholas Thompson. We are continuing our series, State of the Union. The goal of this activist platform is to identify issues within labor and hold those elected accountable while presenting solutions to the issues that we face, ultimately breaking down barriers and uniting all members. We will go from component to component, union to union, federation to federation, until our unions are equitable and is working for all members. We are continuing to focus on systemic anti-Black racism and discrimination in the union. This public platform exists because our Black voices are not being heard nor represented internally. No more silence, because Black lives matter in labor. Today, we are going to tell the story of a Black union executive who was disciplined by way of removal from office without due process. He was the first Black component president in the entire history of both the component and parent union. Carl Gannon was a rising star in the union. He is the former national president of the union that represents veteran affairs workers and sat on the national board of directors of the parent union. He was the co-chair of the National Human Rights Committee, as well as the National Joint Employment Equity Council of the Public Service of Canada. He was the only Black executive on the almost exclusively white, mostly male, National Board of Directors. In short, he was the poster boy for the union, the Black poster boy for the union. After serving 12 years in the union and 4 years as national president, Carl was unceremoniously removed from office while on sick leave by the component's national executive. Union Matters received a copy of that letter. Union Matters will not pronounce on the innocence or guilt of Carl Gannon here today. That's not why we're here. We're here to focus on systemic anti-Black racism and whether due process was afforded to this Black executive, former executive, and whether the Constitution was adhered to. The parent union's constitution is the supreme law of the union. As a matter of fact, Section 9 of the Constitution states that the constitution of components shall be fully consistent with the Constitution of the Union and shall in no way contravene its provisions. Subsection 7 goes on to state that each component and its officers shall be subject to the disciplinary provisions of Section 25. And Regulation 19.4 says that any and all charges against a member shall be placed in writing, signed by the member or members making the charge, and shall be submitted to the appropriate body for consideration. It goes on to say that the appropriate body shall establish an internal or external impartial review committee consisting of 3 people to investigate and assess the charges, including the receipt of oral and written evidence. The members charged with misconduct shall be provided with a copy. Both the members making the charge and those being charged will be afforded with the right to appear before the committee. In Carl Gannon's case, none of this occurred. The National Executive met one day, wrote up the allegations in a resolution, and voted on it in that meeting. Absolutely no due process was afforded to Carl Gannon. No tribunal was struck, no witnesses, no statements, no reports. The National Executive was the judge, jury, and executioner. flagrant breach of the principles of natural justice, and even the parent union's constitution, which all components are bound by. Carl Gannon still followed the process and appealed the decision to the parent union. However, instead of appointing a tribunal empowered to hear appeals, the parent union delegated the matter back to the component, which handled the appeal process. The very same national executive that acted contrary to the parent union's constitution was now responsible for the appeal process. Carl Gannon's days were numbered. He lost the appeal. His vice president that presided over the resolution to remove him based on unfounded allegations then became the national president. Carl Gannon then quit his job with Veterans Canada, Veteran Affairs, as he could not return to the workplace with all these allegations hanging over his head. He was humiliated, broken, and ashamed. Following the loss of his job, his marriage broke down, and he was left with nothing. Carl is joining us tonight to share his experience as a Black man in the union. But before I bring him on, I want to bring on an expert on constitutional matters. Ryan Ward is a longtime union activist. For over 20 years, he has held several positions in the union, including president of the Greater Toronto Area Council, secretary and director, and he has been heavily involved in drafting changes and rewriting constitutions, having put forward over 100 amendments and leading a team of representatives in ensuring various constitutions are written with consistency and to ensure there are no conflicting clauses. Welcome, Ryan. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Nicholas.
How are you doing this evening?
I'm having an enjoyable evening. I've been watching football all day and cleaning and having a very good day and looking forward to this.
All right. Well, Ryan, let's get right into it. How can a component executive remove a sitting president without an independent investigation? Can that happen?
There are a number of different provisions depending upon what component it is. The ultimate underlying final authority, though, goes to the PSAC National Constitution, and in particular, the discipline section, which is section 25.
So if a component does not follow section 25, is that a violation of the parent union's constitution?
Absolutely. For instance, I took CEIU's bylaws, section 8.5.2, and it says all such regulations shall be fully consistent with these bylaws and will and with the Constitution of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. All such regulations shall have the same force and effect as the bylaws from which they flow. In Union of Taxation Employees, there's a section 12 discipline, which also has our various matters that talk about how all sections within a local's constitution have to follow the national UTE and then ultimately the PSAC section 25. So all leads to the national constitution of the PSAC.
Thank you. So based on what you've heard here tonight, does that sound like adherence to the National Union's constitution?
The way it was put essentially by yourself and the way that I heard about it with CBC, there's certain, it would completely depend upon the way UVAE constitution is structured, but ultimately it sounds like it was not followed exactly the way that UVAE does, and then ultimately how PSAC does overarching.
Thank you very much. Brian, I want to thank you for coming. I'm just going to take you backstage for a minute, and we're going to bring on our next speaker tonight. Thank you very much. That was Ryan Ward. union activist and expert on constitutional matters in the labor movement. Thank you very, very much, Ryan, for joining us. At this time, I would like to introduce Carl Gannon to share a little bit of his experience as a Black man in the labor movement. Good evening, Carl. Welcome.
How's it going there, Nicholas?
Very good. Thank you very much for joining us. I know, over the past while, must have been a very challenging time for you. Before I get into any questions, I would just like to ask you not to get into any of the allegations that were specifically made against you, but I'd like you to tell of your general experience, what it was like for you getting involved in the union. We had a chat earlier today, where you shared with me how you were referred to with your dress code, and tell us about that. Tell us what you've experienced.
Absolutely. Now, before we even get into it, there is just one thing that I would just like to say just very quickly, is I don't want anybody to misconstrue anything that I'm doing right now as any sort of attack on any union or any specific person. The reality of the situation is that I'm a unionist. I love my union, and I always have loved my union. I've dedicated pretty much my life to my union and my career to my union. And so I'm doing what I kind of feel that I have to do at this particular moment. But I just don't want anybody to understand. I don't want anybody to misconstrue anything that I'm doing and think that I have some sort of hatred against the union or something, anything of that nature. So I just wanted to put that out there first. So the reality is that I started off as a shop steward back in Halifax, back in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And right off the bat, I love the union. I love the union. I love what I was able to do for my members. I love that I was able to resolve issues and improve their working lives, and improve the environment within our offices. As I kind of progressed, I progressed very quickly, and our national president was going to retire, and so I decided that I was going to throw my hat in the ring. And I was at that time just a local president. I kind of somewhat had maybe a misguided view as to what that actually meant and what that executiveship kind of somewhat meant and what kind of came with that. I probably kind of thought that I was going to come in and everything was going to be kumbaya and we're all going to be holding hands and it's skipping and it's going to be great. We're going to save the world. We're going to do things that nobody's ever done. Right from the get-go, I received a bit of a wake-up call right at convention. And so at convention, things started okay. But once I started to kind of pick up a little bit of momentum, once I started to pick up a little steam, and some of the delegates started to buy into my vision for the component moving forward, things started to change very quickly. And so there were delegations, including things like Quebec, where I couldn't actually get in. Quebec shut me down. The entire region shut me down. They would not let me campaign in their region. The only time that they were going to give me was at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. That was basically a half an hour before actual elections were scheduled. And so I had to reach out to the anti-harassment coordinator for the convention and try to figure something out, because it was bad. People were saying really horrible things about me. It was tough. And somehow we got through that and we were successful. We won by 2 votes. And the very first day that I reported to work in Ottawa in our national office, I realized that we had a big problem. And the big problem was that we had no files. All of our grievance files, all of our open files, all of our everything was gone. It was totally sabotaged. And so as being a new president that's trying to establish myself and trying to really hit the ground running, it was a tough time at that time. We're fighting conservatives and fighting cuts, and it was tough. It was a really, really tough time. And on top of all those things, I was also fighting some conceptions and fighting some ideologies within my own component, within my own union. And so we had to rebuild all of our files. We had to rebuild pretty much our entire national office and the way that we did business. But we did it. We did it, and we really worked our butts off, and I'm proud of what we were able to accomplish. We accomplished a lot of amazing things, a lot of things that nobody thought that we would ever accomplish. We accomplished. But what comes with that is anytime that you're the first, anytime that you are you are a trailblazer, anytime that you are bucking a system, you can understand that system at times is going to buck back, and it's something that you're going to have to deal with. And so the comments, the snickering, the snares, they were sometimes really tough to deal with. Comments about the way that I dressed. Most of us in the union, even at the executive level, we dress rather casually. So you may have a hoodie on with your, I have my UVAE hoodie on or something like that, a hat on, some jeans. Most of us dress that way. The problem was that when I dressed that way that everybody else dressed, and I was kind of looking like kind of a thug. I kind of heard these comments about, I'm doing literally the exact same thing as everybody else. And so I realized that the expectations for me, even though we're doing the same things, the expectations for me were set. The bar was very, very high. I had to excel in order to just be accepted. And so I went out and pretty much spent all my money on a new wardrobe and changed the way that I dressed. And when I changed the way that I dressed, I always had on a suit, I always had on a tie, I always looked extremely professional, because I really didn't want to be called a thug. I didn't want to be looked at in a certain way. And so when I started dressing that way, of course, there were snickers on the other side of that now, like, oh, Carl is always overdressed, and who does this guy think that he is? And so it's kind of, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But it was much easier for me to deal with being looked at as being overdressed than being looked at as a thug or some other thing that I kind of wasn't. The reality is I have no criminal record. I have no run-ins with the law and whatnots like that. And so I think that I should be kind of somewhat afforded the same. I should be afforded the same, the same realities that other people should be afforded. That if I want to put on a hoodie, I don't think that I'm a thug. I don't want to necessarily always wear a suit and tie, but that was my reality. So it's been tough. It's been tough, but you put your head down, you work, and you understand that you're in a position that everybody's watching, and I worked my butt off. And like I said, I accomplished a lot of amazing things. My star took off beyond anything that I could ever even think, beyond, I'm sure, what anybody else could have thought. And unfortunately, it kind of, you do good things sometimes and you get a bit of a target put on your back, and you have to maintain standards that aren't really kind of maintainable because they've been set in a way that just, it wasn't fair.
Okay. All right. How has this impacted your life? What's happening lately? Where are you? How have you been?
It's impacted my life in ways that, honestly, I never thought. There are things that happen that, it's been almost 2 years now, and it's still tough. I've healed from a lot of things, but it's still tough, to know that there's a lot of relationships, internal relationships, people that I connected with internally, like internal to my union, that I thought we were friends for life. I thought we were friends for life. And unfortunately, a lot of them we haven't, since all this stuff has happened, we haven't even spoken. We may kind of have a passing thing. Obviously my marriage broke down, and I don't have my children or my ex-wife kind of in my life the way that they've always been in my life. This all happened, basically, everything. I literally went from the biggest rising star to literally having nothing in about 2.5 months. 2.5 months. My whole life fell apart in about 2.5 months. And so I've taken time, I've rebuilt what I had to rebuild, started a small business, and trying to kind of do what I do. But the reality is that I've been blackballed in a lot of different places. I tried to kind of run in the last election, and there were some issues. There were some things that kind of came up that were unfortunate because it was based on a narrative that wasn't true. And there's nothing that I can do.
Was it connected to your removal?
Yes.
I see.
Yes. And unfortunately, there was nothing that I could do with that narrative at that time to convince anybody that, this is what the real situation is. Unfortunately, you look like you've kind of gone through a certain process. People hear certain things, and it's tough sometimes to overcome the gossip and the hearsay that unfortunately is sometimes purposely kind of put out there to really kind of muddy waters that nobody really knows what's going on. Nobody really knows what's happening. And because I kind of closed my mouth, because every time that I opened my mouth, it seemed like that was a hit against me. Like if I kind of tried to clarify something kind of came out that wasn't true. And I tried to just clarify it. I was looked at as kind of the aggressor. I was looked at as the person that was kind of in the wrong, even though I was just trying to defend myself. Like I'm just trying to point out that this isn't necessarily kind of how this particularly happened. I'm literally the bad guy in this case. I'm being held accountable for things that I'm saying, and I'm literally just protecting myself. And so, I mean, it is what it is at times, but I've got myself to a place at least that I'm able to kind of somewhat move forward with my life, try to rebuild from what I have, and some things still hurt. Some things still hurt a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carl. That was Carl Gannon, a former national component president. And he says that as a Black trade unionist, he's had to work harder. He's had to dress differently. He's had to change a lot of things to be accepted. And still, that was not good enough. Did Carl Gannon being Black play a role in his removal? Is systemic anti-Black racism at play here? If Carl was white, would he have been denied due process? Joining us to delve into these questions is Din Kamaldin. He is the chair of the Black Caucus at the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, and he is a long-standing activist and a human rights advocate. Din, welcome. Good evening. You're on mute. Can you unmute yourself, Din?
Good evening, Nicholas.
Good evening. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on. I'd like to say hello to Ryan, and I'd like to say hello to Carl. Carl, I deeply feel for you. And I'm sorry you had to go through this. Nicholas, I'm looking at some of the information that has been provided, and naturally he was removed without due process because of really two financial irregularities, bylaw 8, section 1F and K, which to me, given how he had to jump into that position, there would have been some learning curve that should have been provided to him. But I'm kind of concerned about bylaw 11, section 2, that is to do with internal control. I'm just wondering, was the vice president and the treasurer held accountable for that? Did this happen in the first year or in his last fourth year? That I don't know. I'm sure there was audit reports that could have flagged this, that the board would have to address. I don't know how that transpired. But as far as the investigation, I believe he should have been afforded an independent investigation Given the structure of the board of the directors, as you indicated, where mostly of them are white male, you would think for better decision, they could have gone and got an independent investigator to review all the documents in place. The other thing, I'm looking at the appeal itself. So the people that passed the first judgment had to hear the appeal and make a decision on the appeal. That in itself is faulty, just like the investigation, because it was not handled by a independent investigator. Not only that, if I take in consideration the convention and how Carl was treated at the convention and how he was basically, how should I say, alienated because of who he was and how he dressed. So, based on that, right, I have determined that yes, he was removed because of the color of his skin. And even if he had survived, they would have still gone after him and removed him using the election process. They have the ability, they control all the committees, they elect the people on those committees, so that transparency is not there. Although there's a governance model in place, but nobody follows the governance model. Because in order to follow the governance model, there has to be some moral grounds, and there has to be the need of ethical approach to the decisions. So your ethics comes to play. Having said that, the barriers and the root of anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination, they run deep in all unions from what I've seen. And I've gone from website to website looking at the governance models. And there is no will to ensure that the moral and the ethical standards are applied to those governance models to ensure that everybody is given a fair treatment and justice that they deserve. This systemic anti-Black racism are historically embedded in the society, culture, in the laws, in the attitudes. They are built into institutions and sustain the social and economic disparities. Racist acts, no matter how sublet, must no longer be ignored or tolerated. Even the most sublet and microaggression forms of racism contribute to the conditions that permit overt racism to occur, just like Carl experienced in Quebec. In this case, using microaggression to remove Carl from the position of power by utilizing mechanisms in place to achieve this goal, which they did. Microaggression is used not to allow Black people to position of powers. That includes selecting and creating or setting barriers. We are interested in not skin folk. We are interested in kin folks. You understand what I'm saying? They can use one of us to damage each other, and that is known. What we, as the members of the unions, must work towards at the grassroots to combat the anti-Black racism is to ensure the Black leadership voice must be recognized and respected. The Black leadership gains seats at the table, committees, decision-making, and political engagement. We must continue to speak up against and expose racism in the union, workplace, and support our Black colleagues. As a non-Black colleagues, for our non-Black colleagues, it's important to show your allyship and condone unjust actions against Black people. We need to lobby for political action from governments and other decision makers. Decision making will require continuous engagements. Systemic racism is without limit more damaging than interpersonal racism. So while it's nice to adjust our personal beliefs, it's more important to remember that anti-Black racism work isn't about changing hearts. It's about changing systems. How do we move forward? How do we seek justice for Carl? Seeking justice for Carl is a way of combating racism. Carl has suffered mental trauma. Mental trauma. I say no more than that. It pains me. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. And for those of you who are commenting, so I just want to clarify one thing. This is not any platform that is specific to one union, right? All unions are welcome. This is a public platform. It's not specific to any specific individual union or under the confines of traditional unionism. This platform is to address systemic anti-Black racism across unions. Thank you very much, Din, for joining us. Union Matters is about fully addressing issues that we face. Next up, I want to bring on David Lewis. He's a qualified mediator, negotiator, facilitator, and human rights activist. He is the co-founder and CEO of Lewis Dispute Resolution and a Toronto boutique alternative dispute resolution firm providing conflict resolution and training across the GTA. David, good evening. Welcome. Unmute.
Good evening. My pleasure to be here.
Good evening. How are you doing this evening? Welcome.
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm just sort of trying to reconcile my emotions over what has happened to my brother Paul. But it's just a really, really painful experience to listen to.
Right. Well, let me ask you some questions about this, and just in general here, in general terms, especially with recent events that would have been brought to the public forefront, especially in labor. What do you make of all of this as a Black man?
It's pretty coincident, so that I just did a workshop yesterday on the issue of the paradox of anti-Black racism in social justice spaces. And that came out of my experience as a union activist, as someone represented by a union. I took a look at the number of how we are represented in the labor movement. I literally went through a list that I found on the Government of Canada's website of all the unions, and I looked at the people in power, the decision makers. And it really was striking to me who were at the head of those organizations. I did not see people like myself. And it caused me to really wonder why this is the case. And I've been doing some research around that piece for a while, which is one of the reasons why I had the workshop, because I really wanted to educate individuals about the existence of oppression and anti-Black racism in general, in institutions that are supposed to be all about dismantling barriers for marginalized communities, marginalized individuals, oppressed groups. These organizations appear to be doing exactly what the masses or the majority are doing. So the whole issue of anti-Black racism is very, very real. Oppression is real, and when we look at the unions, they have to take a better stance, a better position to really address this issue if they want to really live up to the mandate that they established for.
Thank you very much. So what else, what can be done in labor? What are your views on how labor should be addressing these issues? We're hearing about it, and it's not that it wasn't happening before, it's just being highlighted now. People are now coming forward. So in your view, from a resolution perspective, how do we move forward from all of this?
Well, there's a political piece, which I always think that politics is not practical. So there's the whole voting and the appearance of democracy, but we know that that's just a facade. There's no real democracy in these sort of institutions. But something that really struck me and that I've been proposing to other institutions over the past while is that, notwithstanding the fact that there are democratic processes to elect individuals, we need to do more to recruit individuals from the most marginalized and oppressed communities to represent, to have positions and seats at the table of power. One of the ways we can do that is to have advisory groups that are not necessarily elected, but if, for instance, we have a committee of 5 elected white folks, and you represent a community that has diversity of people, why not have an advisory committee that represent those subsections that will feed into the elected officials group, right? In that way, in some form, we can get representation, we can get visibility, we can get a seat at the table. But I think a lot of the times we talk about it, but we really don't want to do it because it's a struggle for power. And it's a struggle to maintain the institutional ideologies that exist and the system of oppression that exists. Because once those are dismantled, the whole power base collapses. And I don't think the people in power really want that to happen. So we have to really push to have a seat at the table, and a practical way of doing that is to push for advisory committees that can sort of supplement the positions that we excluded from.
Okay, so you brought some very interesting points there, and one of them is an advisory council that works hand in hand with elected officials and representing marginalized members, right? So there's that balance and that voice at the table, and it's something that we're consistently lacking, that voice at the table. I want to thank you for joining us here this evening. That was David Lewis. He is a qualified mediator and facilitator. I'm just going to bring back on Carl Gannon just for a quick second, and then we're going to take a break. Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I did want to address something really quickly, just based on what Din said. And so he asked a question as to when did these allegations come to bear? And they literally came to bear just that actual day in that actual meeting. And so these weren't long-standing things. We've every year we've gotten a audit report. Never had any problems or anything like that. And so these weren't long-standing type things or anything like that. I had no idea that there was even these problems whatsoever. I found out about the problems from the letter that I kind of sent you, showing basically that I was removed from office for these particular reasons, which didn't even really actually state what the actual irregularities were or anything of that nature. It's just very vague type things like that. So to this day, I still actually have no idea what the actual financial irregularities actually are. The other thing that I did want to just mention very quickly is just to outline some of the systemic nature of some of the things that I had to deal with, because it sparked something from convention. So at our last convention, we have a particular clause in our bylaws that allow, as part of their job, the national president to transfer money between line items. And so if there's a line item that you predict is going to be underspent, you as a national president are able to move money between line items in order to ensure that you're still within budget, but you still, you're using up basically your budget. And so that ability, which we've always had as a national president, which most national presidents have that exact same ability, that was taken away from me at the last convention. And it was taken away under the guise of, well, nobody should have that much power. It doesn't give any authority to actually spend any money or to do anything. It literally gives the authority to fiscally move money between line items. That's it. And it's something that literally has been a part of our bylaws from the existence of our component and through basically every other component. National president of the PSAC has the exact same ability to do that. And so, unfortunately, when I'm the president, it now all of a sudden becomes too much for one person, even though it's always been like that for 65 years. And we need to change that. Now we need to have a committee that's going to look over these things and that's going to validate these things. And so it wasn't too much for any of our other past presidents, who obviously didn't look the way that I look. But when you look like me, then that's too much authority, and we can't allow you to do that. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that and throw that out there, because it's another instance, unfortunately, just showing how things were always different for me. Even though I'm in the exact same position doing the exact same things, there's no problems whatsoever. We're going to create a problem where a problem actually didn't exist originally.
And I think that issue, just that situation, it reminded me of the beginning of my own presidency, where my predecessor was able to govern however they saw fit. And as soon as I took office, well, you have to follow this. You can't do this. You can't do this. You can't do this. But my predecessor said, yes, this is how they've governed.
Absolutely.
And unchallenged.
Absolutely. There's a very real double standard that unfortunately we have to live by. And the unfortunate thing about that is that you have if you're going to be in an executive position, you have no choice. This is just how it is. And some people don't necessarily kind of understand that when you look like us and you are in a particular role, you're in a particular position, you're going to have to conform in certain ways. And you're going to have to grow some pretty thick skin, because you're going to hear things and you're going to see things that are really not worth your trouble of saying something or fighting it, or you have to pick and choose your battles. But this is what we live with. This is an everyday thing, an every issue thing, where we just continually have to deal with these things, and you have to literally just kind of brush that stuff off and move forward. Nobody else has to do that. Other people that are in my position, they don't have to do that. They've never been asked questions that I've been asked. They've never been asked to justify certain things that I've been asked to justify on a very, very, very regular basis, like a very regular basis. And so it's just a part of our life that I wanted the viewership to kind of understand that, these are our realities. We don't have the privilege of getting the benefit of the doubt. If we can't prove it, then unfortunately you did it or you didn't do it. But whatever the benefit of the doubt that most people would get, that your predecessors would get, that your successors will get, you are not going to get that benefit of the doubt. And it's a tough cookie to swallow, tough pill to swallow, but it's the reality of our life. And so I think it's important to kind of put that out there.
Right. Carl, I want to thank you again for coming on the program today and being courageous to tell your story and to share some of the things that and how this has impacted you. And that's what this program is all about, addressing, bringing to the forefront these issues and providing solutions for them, right? We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back. We'll be speaking with the president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, Sister Patty Coates. So we'll be right back. Just enjoy this short entertainment. Welcome back. I hope you enjoy that session from the islands. Patty Coates is the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, Canada's largest provincial labour federation. She was elected to the position at the OFL Power of Many 15th Biennial Convention in 2019. Sister Patty is also the first woman to hold a position, and it's something that we lack deeply in labor, are women in leadership position. Sister Patty, good evening. Welcome to Union Matters.
Good evening, Brother Nicholas. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. Sister Patty, unions are struggling to address systemic discrimination and anti-Black racism. I brought you on here today to tell us, how is the OFL dealing with this issue?
Nicholas, that's a very good question. What I'm going to speak about is what we are doing at the OFL with the support of our affiliates. So as a labor organization, we must recognize and acknowledge that our very own structures and rules, policies, and practices may play a role in the oppression of Black, Indigenous, and racialized members. And it hit home for me actually in June when I attended an online annual meeting of a large union. At the same time, the world watched as Black Lives activists and allies rallied and marched and following the brutal, unnecessary deaths of Black folks. But during this meeting, it became evident that the very rules of order for this meeting that they all voted on became a barrier for equity-seeking members to put forward and speak on equity motions. So that, watching that happen, it rocked me to the core. And I knew that I had to do something about this within our organization. And I realized that those similar rules, our policies, practices may be oppressing racialized groups in the OFL. So at the end of June, a motion was passed unanimously at the OFL Executive Board meeting to embark on a deep discrimination and anti-racist review. And we all know that structure is what makes and allows or perpetrates systemic racism. And we also must look at our structures. And more importantly, with that, we must see the humanity of those that are intentionally and unintentionally targeted and discriminated by these structures. So as part of our anti-oppression review at the OFL, we are first bringing together all of the equity VPs that represent our worker of color, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, LGBTQI+, workers with disabilities, and young workers, the OFL officers of the Federation, the executive board members, all to be part of this working committee to look at how we run our meetings, run our convention, where we place equity reports and equity motions on the agendas, when people are able to get up to speak. Are we ensuring diversity? We're going to look at our rules, policies, and practices. We're going to look at our constitution. We're going to look at our hiring practices and flag anything that comes from our review that identifies systematic racism, that will identify the barriers, and that limits the access of our racialized members, and of course, anything that causes oppression. And we will also look at who is not at the table when discussions are being made, when there's decisions that are being made, and conversations that are being had. So the purpose is to work towards the full and true racial equality within our organization. So some of the things that we must do, that's part of the work at the Federation, is, of course, to challenge our biases and prejudices. And we have to be honest and open about that. We also have to educate ourselves and name systemic racism within our Federation. And of course, we have to take action moving towards dismantling policies and practices and rules, and build ones that ensure equality and that are in line with inclusiveness and diversity. And if need be, we can engage in outside resources and expertise when needed to assist us during this process. And one of the organizations that we are reaching out to is CBTU, the Coalition for Trade Black Unionists. Of course, we know this is going to be a daunting and exhaustive task, yet we know it's necessary. It's a necessary process that I am committed to. And it's an exercise that must be ongoing with checks and balances and a means for transparency, accountability, along with regular reports to our executive board. So I'm really excited as a president of the OFL to help facilitate this process that we're undertaking in our federation.
Now, you've outlined a lot of different things there, and I want to ask you specifically, what is the OFL doing to ensure that there's more racialized members in elected positions and senior positions? I had a quick look at your the layout of your executive, and what I can see, your secretary treasurer is a racialized person. What are some of the things that OFL can do to ensure that there's more of those of more racialized executives?
Well, we have to, of course, reach out. We have to have conversations. We need to ensure that our equity committees also have their voices heard. We listen to what their needs and concerns are, and we take that and we move forward with that. We already have, and I started this as soon as I was elected into the position of Secretary Treasurer 4.5 years ago. We changed our agenda at our executive board meetings. It used to be that the equity committee reports were right at the bottom of the agenda after everything else. And we changed that around. We actually moved the reports of our equity VPs to the top of our agenda, following the beginning, of course, approval of the agenda, the minutes, our equity statement, land acknowledgement, and then we move on to our committee reports. And I think that's important. Some of the things that we need to change up on how we do things, and to ensure that those voices are heard and they're heard up front, and they can bring their resolutions forward to the our recommendations forward to the executive board. We also changed, and that was a push from our convention 2 years ago, a push from our equity committees to be allowed to actually present motions, resolutions to our convention. In the past, they couldn't. They had to go to their unions. They had to go through the executive board. And now at our last convention, committees were allowed to bring forward and endorse resolutions. And I think those are steps forward. They're small steps, but they are steps forward. And I think that's how we move this forward.
That sounds okay. That sounds good. Now, let me ask you this. How about a mentorship program for Black, racialized, and Indigenous members that would expose them to all of these processes, where they could get some mentorship? Is that something that the OFL can do?
It's something that we're absolutely open to, and that's what I'm hoping with this process, that it's not just mechanical, that we're also putting, as I said, these are human lives, and I work on love and equality and bringing everyone together and all of the voices together. And yes, I'm a white woman. However, I've had my struggles as well, as I have privilege, but I also have had struggles because I'm a woman. Right. And here I am at the end of my career. Finally, I broke that glass ceiling in Ontario at our Federation of Labor, and I want to be able to open that up to others, whether you are a woman, whether you're intersectional, whether you're Black person, trans, like for everyone. That's what unions are about. That's what the labor movement is about. That's what we push for on the ground. And we have to ensure that we push for that within our own organization. And that's what we want to do at the OFL.
Sister Patty, are you seeking re-election?
I absolutely will seek re-election, yes.
When is the next OFL
A year from now.
A year
Yeah.
from now.
A
Okay.
year November, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll see what that looks like because we're, in
Right.
times of COVID and we want to make sure that everyone is safe, but we also want to make sure that people have their voice, that we ensure a true democracy. And so that's going to be part of the discussions that
Now,
we have.
just on a side note, as you've spoken about that, one of the things that I've been trying to tell unions is that we must adapt to our ever-changing environment, embracing technology, and working to ensure that if this pandemic goes on for the long haul, or if another pandemic hits, we're able to continue operating, we're able to continue mobilizing virtually. So if this pandemic goes on or something else comes up and we're still under these conditions, will the OFL be able to hold its convention electronically?
Well, that will be a discussion that our executive board will make. We do have our equity VPs that also sit on our executive board. And so we'll have those discussions and we'll have them sooner than later. Because as many know, when you are working towards a convention, it doesn't start just a few months before. We start a full year before convention. And we need to make sure that we are ensuring democracy and that we're moving forward in a positive, inclusive, diverse way.
Right. Thank you. And one final closing question, Sister Patty. What does it mean for Black, racialized, and Indigenous workers if unions don't address this issue within its own ranks? What does it mean for us?
Well, I think, we as a labor movement, we have to, we can't just say we have to act. We have many sayings and chants within the labor movement. For example, an injury to one is an injury to all. Injustice to one is an injustice to everyone. No justice, no peace. So it's our duty at the OFL and within our labor movement to live these statements that I just cited. And it's about taking action, not just making these statements or speeches or passing motions or writing letters to the government demanding they deem racism a public health crisis, which we've done at the OFL and have all of our affiliates sign on to that. It's actual actions where our members see we are committed to making these changes, and that change must include the voices and lived experience of Black, Brown, Indigenous women, young people, and persons with disability. And as leaders, we must set the tone and be the example. Saying not racist doesn't just cut it. Thinking that we're not racist isn't enough. So I'm committed to the work of being an anti-racist that is needed both personally as a white woman, that I have to look internally, and what's needed within the OFL to call out racism, to acknowledge the systematic racism within and take action and build a better reality for our organization, for every one of our racialized members, where they can truly see themselves in everything that we do. And diverse and inclusive representation matters. And so this is how we work towards building trust, loyalty, and moving forward. And we can't afford not to do this work. We must build and maintain an inclusive, racially equitable organizational culture. And I know that I'm at near the end of my career, and yes, I will be seeking another term of office. But during that time, I certainly want to mentor. I want to bring forward those voices. I want to be able to tap those that are part of those equity seeking groups, tap them on their shoulders. And already I see many, many leaders out there that, I think are doing incredible work. And, those workers, those are Black, those are Brown or Indigenous members, and they're already doing incredible work. But if we do this work helps everyone to succeed. It benefits every single member.
Thank you very much, Sister Patty. That was Sister Patty Coates, president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, and she says that diversity and inclusivity in representation matters. This is the end of our program today, and we'll be continuing to highlight anti-Black racism, systemic discrimination. The challenge that we face is that it's not that we're not only facing these issues in our respective workplaces, but we're facing these issues within our unions as well. So who do we turn to for help? Who do we turn to for representation? If you do not understand the equity issues that I face, how can you advocate on my behalf? How do you do that? So these are questions that it's becoming more clear to me that we need a revolution, and it's here. We're not going to continue waiting for 10 years for these changes that the system has presided over for decades and saw no problem. For decades, saw no problem with the equity issues. And those who presided over the inequity issues are now responsible for fixing it. Right? So something is drastically wrong when our voices are not at the table. Where are our voices at the table? We are continuing to call for an anti-Black racism task force across the union to come up with practical solutions that includes our voices at the table. Not you deciding over the system that you created, that you flourished under, that you thrived under, that you benefited under. These systems need to be dismantled. And our voices are needed to create new systems. We cannot, it's not that it's broken, they're functioning exactly how they should function, which is to keep one group exclusive and the other groups, well, let's say non-exclusive. So we don't need to fix a system, we need a new system, because this system is functioning exactly the way that it should. So we're continuing to call for an anti-Black racism task force. And the reason why I'm saying just anti-Black racism is because when you consistently lump us in with everyone else moves forward and we always get left behind. Just like under the Employment and Equity Act, where we're almost never chosen. And those in office and management, and the employer gets to say that they meet the targets for racially visible minority. Yes, you're meeting the target because you're consistently picking all groups except the Black group. But that was not the spirit and intent of the legislation, to discriminate against Black workers. That was not the spirit or intent of the legislation. So that needs to change. The Employment and Equity Act needs to change to benefit all racially visible workers. So ladies and gentlemen, comrades, I want to thank you for joining us this evening on Union Matters. Feel free to reach out. If there's something brewing within your union, reach out to us. We want to hear about it. We want to highlight those issues and try to provide solutions for these issues, because clearly having these discussions internally has not worked. It has not worked for decades. So, and to me, that represents the definition of insanity, doing the same thing and expecting different results. Just won't happen. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicholas Thompson, and have a great evening. I'm going to leave you with Very inspiring video from Gary Beals, Black Toronto artist. Thank you for joining us.
I can feel it, I won't conceal it. They can't control me, I'm wildfire. I pay my own way, I earn the whole way. I'm worth the whole bag, you can't deny. Diamond tears roll down my face, I must be happy. Crystal clear raindrops won't drown my precious time. All this black and gold on me, I must be royalty. Live life like I just left my stresses all behind. Blood red roses, golden kisses, frozen moments. Blood red roses, golden kisses, frozen moments. Can you feel it? That electric feeling. Move like you mean it. I know you feel it. Why not reveal it? Don't you conceal it? Diamond tears roll down your face. You must be happy. Crystal clear raindrops won't drown your precious smile. Got you black and gold, they say you must be royalty. Live life like you just left your stresses all behind. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. We're gonna love forever. We're gonna love forever. Love is all we need. Love is all I need. We're gonna love forever. We're gonna love forever. Love is all we need. Love is all you need. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. Love is all we need. Love is all I need. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. Love is all we need. Love is all you need. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. Love is all we need. Love is all I need. Blood red roses, golden kisses, golden moments. Love is all we need. Love is all you need.
This is Union Matters with Nicholas Thompson.